So, Professor Tootle, good morning.
Morning to you.
So I'm not frustrated, but I'm hoping for not a catharsis because that's too melodramatic. I'm hoping for a conglomeration of today is our I think 93rd conversation, and they go usually a little over an hour, so it's at least 93 hours, but maybe another 15 minutes or a half an hour. So we've done 150 hours, guess, of conversation over the last 3, 4, 5 years, however long we've been doing this. And it occurred to me, and I don't mean that this isn't going to be about the presidential debate, but that was a spark when former President Trump bragged about a leader, a leader of Hungary, and who's moved his country to be authoritarian rather than democratic, and bragging about that. And the RNC, no, it wasn't the RNC. It was the conservative movement held Viktor Orban in Florida, or wherever they held their. And it occurred to me that all these conversations we've had over 100 different topics, there is a healthy bent in America towards authoritarianism, and not just on the right. So I mentioned Trump and the conservative movement, but it's also on the left, as you often point out. So today's conversation, I'd like it to be a conglomeration of at least 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 shows that we've had about what it is in human nature that needs an authoritarian in their lives. And not personally, although there are soccer coaches and PTOs and ministers and neighbor HOAs. There's a ton of authoritarians in society, but I think it's the same bent of somebody who just wants somebody to solve the damn problem for them. And if we have to override everybody else, then we're just going to do that. And I know you're not a social psychologist, you're not a social anthropologist, but I want you to take us through some history of where we are today in America and why in my opinion, why we should fight that urge of authoritarianism, whatever stripe it comes in. So I did some research. Jake, I'm glad you're in. I've done some research. There's like 5 or 7. Okay, not very good research. I can't remember if it's 7 different types of authoritarianism. You might take us through some, or maybe you won't. But it's clear that out of the 185, 195 countries in the world, that 60 of those are authoritarian or authoritarian leaning. But those 60 countries equal 72% of the world's population. So most of the world still lives under an authoritarian regime. Now, here's what's a little scary to me is that 32% of Americans lean towards authoritarian. They either want a strong man, which Trump said in the debate, bragging about Viktor Orban, or the military to solve problems and lead the way. What's interesting is the Pew Research Center did a study. It said 25% of those authoritarians are on the left, 37% on the right, but 29% in the center. So we think it's like a left or right thing. Well, no, it's actually there's all sorts of people that have a tendency to want to have a strong man or woman, I guess, to solve problems for us. So today, I'm going to take you down like 7 different ways. Here are the 7 different ways. I don't usually do this up front, but for you to think of labels. You're finally convincing me. I don't think we want to label people. Everybody now wants to either label somebody a fascist or a communist or a socialist or an ist of something. And I think a label is you're convincing me that we should get rid of that, especially the left or right, unless we're describing the left or right as you describe it. I think you're finally persuading me that we need to adequately describe that if you're left and right, I know that you're actually not American. Stop it. You're anti-American if you're on the left or the right. I think we should reinvent that label. So, what is the idea of America? I'm not sure enough people understand what the idea of America is. So, the history of monarchies and dictatorships and tribal families and security apparatus, I think you describe it as. I want you to go through that again today. I want you to go through all these different things today in one show. Also, federalism on how sure we may have an authoritarian in this state or that state or maybe even at the federal level, but there's a bunch of different states that aren't, and that counter pressures and why that genius of American founders. I think that transcends so many of our issues we've talked about, whether it's guns or abortion or gays or just all the different things. I think that's a really important thing to think about is the importance of federalism. American exceptionalism, I already mentioned that, but I think no one understands American exceptionalism as properly defined. And I know I'm using your language over and over, but these are just things I'd like you to encapsulate in one show so you and I can just send people a link and say, why don't you listen to Professor Tootle for a couple minutes on this topic and see whether that's something you admire or appreciate or whether it's something you should fight against. Left, right. Oh, and then you threw out something really controversial, I think, because you're a little bit more not open borders, but open border-ish, I guess, than I am. I want to lock down our borders and have legal immigration. I'm going to do an op-ed on that, I think. But anyway, but the concept you have, I agree with. That if you believe in freedom or peace or capitalism, peace, and you want to stand up in what you want to fight for, and both in business and your family lifestyle and the way you want to just live, that's actually freedom or peace. And people that like and want that should come here. And if people really don't want that, if they want some fascist or communist or socialist or some totalitarian authoritarian regime, there's lots of countries that works. So I want you to persuade Americans to stop leaning towards authoritarianism of whatever stripe they are. That's the purpose of today's show. All that stuff, I'm just going to stop talking and you can take one and I'll perhaps interrupt you. So, Professor Tootle, talk to us about authoritarianism, please.
All right. Well, I guess I'll start with your last question and your first. How can I convince Americans to reject authoritarianism? And the answer is that I can't do it in an hour because it's something that has to be taught, and it takes a long time to teach it. It takes a long time to develop the culture because in many ways, and this gets to one of the other points you made, the appeal of authoritarianism is in the human condition, is in the human brain, which is universal. So human beings are never going to stop wanting things that authoritarianism offers. And the main thing that well, there are a lot of things that authoritarianism can do for us that make us feel good or reward the evil side of us. And that is that number one, it promises answers. It promises to solve problems. It promises to reward friends, and it promises to punish enemies. It promises justice in this lifetime. And these are all, and it promises security, which are all things that human beings are naturally inclined to want. And you have
A
to,
path or plan. Just let's get out of this mess. It offers us a way, right?
yeah, because it says, here's how we're going to solve this problem. And every act of radical evil, mass murder, one of the big, important, huge, never forget this lessons of history is that mass genocide comes from people who think that what they're doing is good, not from people who think that they're executing an evil plan.
I don't think you've said that in several of our conversations, but do you think most people agree with that?
I don't think most people know it or think about it.
Yeah, fair enough. So
Yeah.
say it again. Try to. I know you said it would be more than an hour, but
Yeah,
go
well,
on that
that's kind of
for
my
a minute.
point, which is that you have to go back to, as I was telling one of my classes last week, the first line of the Declaration of Independence is "when in the course of human events," and then you go back and start reading, Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington, um, uh, and Madison, and every one of them emphasizes something that seems to be completely lost in the modern conversation about politics and history, which is that our founders were very clear that they were forming an imperfect system for imperfect human beings. That what they were doing, the American conception of politics, and this is one of these times where like Okay, don't just cut one sentence out and take it out of context, because what I'm going to say needs explanation. But what they were doing was taking God out of the chain of command. They weren't taking God out of the lives of individuals, but the assumption of the founders was that a personal relationship with God means that nothing comes between the individual and God. But God is not in, God is perfect, right? God is infallible. Therefore, no human being can perfectly discern the will of God. And thus, governments, and this is also in the Declaration, governments are instituted among men. Governments are instituted among human beings. And that means, and this is another thing that sounds shocking when you say it, is that our founding, our government, and what students need to understand is that our government is promising to never solve a problem. And it is
You said
important.
that several times, especially in the last conversation or two. And to me, even that is, I know this sounds horrible. I feel like I'm ignorant. Even with all my degrees and all my experience, I feel ignorant with that because that doesn't like resonate with me. I don't remember being taught that in high school, civics, college, or law school. That it's still, it,
I can't imagine you would have been. I mean, you went through college and law school at the time of like technocratic liberalism, where the assumption was that government can solve problems and that computers and planning and modeling and social science have given us such a great insight that now, yes, it was not true in the past that government couldn't solve problems, but now that we have computers and social science, we can solve problems. You know, one of the things that is, you always point out is that the poverty rate in the United States was going down for the entire history of the United States until we tried to solve it, until we tried to use computers and social science and modeling to solve poverty in America. Because once we applied computers and social science and government incentives to these things, what you ended up doing was creating incentives to keep people where they are in an attempt to solve it once and for all, instead of how do we make this better?
hmm.
Um, and and sticking close to a government based on principles rather than assuming that. And people did the same thing in the law. I mean, think about when you went to law school. When you were in law school, there wasn't a single person out there who, I shouldn't say that. There were very few scholars, and there were very few judges, and there were very few people who read American law to to to, to be that you need to return to fundamental principles over a particular social science result. I mean, you think about the things that would have been interpreted as success in 19, I'm sure you probably graduated from law school in like 1975 or
Oh
85,
gosh, I'm not that old. And 88, 93.
93. So yeah, you're
Oh, you made me old. I'm going to grow out my hair
I
again.
just,
Jeez.
I was trying to think of when your professors were all hired in the wake of the great social science, decisions of the Warren Court, and those were seen as progress, and they were also seen as the only way to achieve progress, rather than saying, we've had a lot of bad laws passed on bad precedent, and we could just go back to the founding ideals and say this is wrong according to the old laws.
Okay,
So
remember what you're going to say,
yeah,
but do a pause and talk about this for a second.
yeah.
Laws, um, and you're saying they're not to be to solve problems. Well, sure, they were to solve problems that set up a system where the federal government solves some problems and the states solve others, and then the people solve other. I mean, that solves problems, doesn't it?
It makes problems better, but it does not and cannot create heaven on earth. It cannot and will not ever produce an end result that will mean that we don't need to stop working on this.
Okay. Okay.
There is no final solution to any problem that involves human beings. We can't just say, oh, well, we used to work on this, but the problem is now solved and now it's behind us. If it's a problem involving the human spirit. or something in the human brain. You know, no
Okay,
matter how
that's
good
another
our
one.
yeah, no matter how good our system of government is, we still have to continue to teach people to follow it because the system isn't so good that it can overcome, ignorance and people of ill will trying to destroy it. You know,
I'm sorry to do one more side
yeah, yeah,
conversation. I think people are misunderstanding the current U.S. Supreme Court.
yeah. But
I
on
happen
this
to
base,
I
but on
happen
precisely this basis, they say, I don't care what the principle is. All I
right.
care about is what is the result.
But people aren't thinking through that. I mean, they can still get the same result they want. They just work through Congress or work through their states, or if their legislatures aren't doing it, if their state allows constitutional amendment. I mean, there's all sorts of way to get the result that they want. Just they can't go through a an elected body of justices. I
Well, you
so I
think about like what is, to get back to our topic, what is authoritarianism? It's not I want to be free to do this. It's I want to impose my will on somebody else. This is if your conception of freedom is that you impose your will on somebody else, then you are an authoritarian. You're saying, no, 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 it's not just that I want to be free to read this book. I want other people to be forced to read this book. Um, well, you're a little closet authoritarian. Um, and so that's why it's unsatisfying when freedom is what the courts decide, because what that leaves unsatisfied is our desire to control other people's lives.
okay. That's a good wrap up on that. Do you have your main thrust?
Yeah,
Uh,
so I would say we first understand that it's inherent in the founding that uh, and our founders absolutely understood that what they were creating was an imperfect system that would guarantee to never solve a problem. Next, that it's
and we're
in
all sorry. We're all
yeah,
supposed to pause after that and clap or stand up and give an ovation. The founders created a system that doesn't solve problems, and we're all supposed to rejoice in that.
yeah. I mean, it's in the Declaration. It says that governments are instituted among men to secure rights, plural. And the purpose of politics is to negotiate between rights, and because human beings are going to have different conceptions of what their rights are. And so what we need is a peaceful process to negotiate between your many rights. There is no single right that all things will ever be reconciled to. There
Love
is no,
it.
yeah. So but why do people not like that? Well, because human beings want to be safe, and safety is in contrast to freedom. Freedom to succeed also means the freedom to fail. And if you and the temptation to remove the freedom to fail is always going to be with us because it will, seem like compassion. And to agree with your point about labels and frameworks, so many of the words we use to describe politics today are um, completely obscure what was actually going on in the discussions of the founders, but not just the found. We keep talking about the founders, but I guess I also want people to understand that this is a whole lost political tradition. It's not just that people knew this stuff in the 1790s, but that from the time of the founding, there were people who disagreed with this, who argued with it, who said it was bad and tried to undermine it. But there were people who were still alive in the 1860s and 1880s and 1890s who were trying to stay true to the principles that would keep human beings free, in contrast to whatever the new modern idea is. I mean, and thankfully, you have politicians like a Calvin Coolidge who come along and say, these new ideas, they come along, but they're all just they're old ideas. They're all more ancient than the ideas of the founders. And keep, sometimes I use the metaphor of a sporting event. in order to explain why people should want to live free lives. And I just say, well, do you, whatever sporting event you enjoy, um,
Football.
football, you want the game called fairly. You want it played according to rules, because then when your team wins, you will know you have won. You and so I, one of the things that was, I mean, there were so many radical elements to the American Revolution and the human condition. Um, but understanding why it was important to eliminate special privilege where it stood, getting rid of titles of nobility. What it does is it frees everybody. And I mean, this is something that Lincoln understood and never stopped kind of explaining to the American people in his time, was that what you need to understand is that protecting the rights of other people is what will give your life greater hope, greater love, greater meaning. Um, and because it will mean that you have, he never put it in these terms, but you will have deeper relationships with other people. You will have honest relationships with other people, and it will come out in every part of your life.
Say that
And
again. Wait, in order to be free and happy and autonomy, we have to protect minority. It wasn't minorities. You said we have to protect.
Well, I mean, the phrase that there's one thing that wraps itself around, entwines itself more closely about the human heart, and that phrase, it's from that Apple of Gold, document that we've mentioned so many times. But you think about what it means to entwine itself more closely about the human heart, the idea of liberty to all, right? That's the only thing that will give enterprise and industry and hope to all, meaning that what kind of a society are we going to live in when everybody is willing to work for their own dreams? And as he later says, let not him who is houseless pull down the home of another, rather let him build his own house so that both will be safe from violence when built. That's what happens when you have liberty to all, right? People are willing to work for their own dreams. They're willing to dream about a better life for themselves. They're willing to not just think about what's best for themselves. They're willing to invest in society for the benefit of their children and grandchildren and people who are going to be born 100 years from now. And in doing so, that's what makes your house safe. That's what makes it possible for us to live good lives. We just don't realize how protecting the rights of our neighbors to be left alone, actually benefits us. But these are all things that have to be taught because they're complicated. They take more than 2 steps to get there. Anything that can be explained in a bumper sticker can support an authoritarian. And we used to always say when campaigning, if it takes more than 3 words to explain, you've lost. Because when we're trying to convince undecided voters, you need a bumper sticker, right? Because undecided voters need a bumper sticker.
Do a
Yeah,
side interjection again. I was listening
yeah,
to NPR yesterday, and they said that the people that are debating um, have to be edgy, and media has to be smart and snarky and short. And you and I are doing the exact opposite. I mean, we're not gaining some mass following. We're not getting rich, but we just keep plugging away. Not every Friday, but most Fridays, we just keep plugging away, trying to have people understand all these different topics of human relations. And what are we just insane, or why don't we go the bumper sticker route though? Why can't we teach freedom and independence and liberty and love of country and American exceptionalism by snippets and Twitter? And what are we doing? Why are we doing this?
because we care that what we're doing is actually true, and we care that it's actually real, and what we're doing is motivated by love, not the baser instincts of,
Okay.
not to pat ourselves on the back or anything, but like, if you actually and this is what one of the other things that sometimes I would say, and you know debates with others, like, don't you want your own beliefs to be true? I mean, and thus, if you're with a bunch of people of goodwill who are helping you work your way through these issues with the idea that, we will never achieve truth and enlightenment, a la God, but what we must do as human beings is keep trying to, you know, see the right as God gives us the ability to see the right. Um, that is a lifelong process. It's not, and here's the other thing. It's not something you can give to someone else. You can never say, "Oh, the government's going to take care of this." I mean, in a way, I feel like that's part of the reason we feel so um, uh, disconnected, or we often confuse charity with a government program, or kindness with a government program. We say we don't have to do this because the government takes care of it, but the government does take care of it. But no system can ever engage in love, and ultimately, every human relationship, if it's going to be of any value to, if you're going to be of any permanent value to yourself and to the rest of the world, you need to be engaged in a constant, um, loving, long-term conversation with other people about discerning what is true, what is beautiful, what is right, how should I arrange my own values. And you can't push that off on somebody else and say, do this for me. It's something you have to do. And there's no royal road to learning geometry, and there's no royal road to developing and maintaining a culture of freedom. It's something that we have to do, and it takes time, and we
Love
don't ever stop.
Love this. We've gone 32 minutes, and there's still a couple other things that I threw out that big gushing right at the beginning. And we're not running out of time by any means yet, but I want to have Bart interject at some point. Go to your next. You took a couple notes what I talked about, and what
Yeah.
left
I,
or
I,
right,
I'm
or
not
what.
sure what this referred to, but something that you said triggered me to remind you that my old answer still applies, which is that pluralism limits evil. One of the things that we want is to try to eliminate evil, but we can't actually eliminate evil. So what our system does is that we need to recognize that um, things that we in the modern day see as failures are actually successes. I say, um, one of the things this is all stuff that if you take it out of context sounds terrible, but like when we see a shooting, a murder, or even a massacre, we tend to think that that undermines the legitimacy of the system instead of seeing it for what it actually is, which is human evil being dropped into a system that limits that from spreading further. And what happens in non-pluralistic societies is not that, uh, the massacre doesn't take place. It's that the massacre turns into a genocide of an authoritarian who is, trying to. Um,
How confident are you in that statement? Because it does sound bad taken out of context. So I'm glad you are trying to have the right setting for this part of the conversation. How
yeah,
confident are you, though, that if we can't do a little bit of changes on assault weapons or,
no, we
or
can. That's kind of my point. But just understand this again, something Theodore Roosevelt said. I feel like I'm quoting all of that, but you know, if you believe that this will will do more than he was talking in this letter about uh, um, initiative, referendum, and recall. And he said, I support these things because I think they represent, on balance, a series of slight betterments over slight hurts. But if you believe that these are going to be revolutionary and that they're going to solve every problem in society, you will work yourself into far-reaching harm. And you will do it in a foolish manner. You're going to end up, or as I explained to my students, you're going to do stupid things in a stupid way and end up committing acts of evil if you're convinced that what you're doing is going to solve the problem rather than make it a little bit better and have costs.
Hmm.
So explain to me what the costs are, explain to me what the benefits are, and understand that when an open conversation is one that says, listen, this is one of these things that are going to hurt 49 things. And what we're advocating because it's going to help, because I think that 51 out of 49 times it's going to be slightly better. This is not going to solve the problem because nothing will solve the problem short of, I always joke, if you want to use social science to solve social problems, take every 17-year-old male and put them in prison and then let them out when they're 30. And we will have no violent crime. And we will have used, why? Because almost all violent crime in America is caused by males aged 17 to 30. Well, it's actually 17 to 25. We can even let them out when they're 25, right? If you want to make sure that we never have any more car accidents, make the speed limit 10, right? There, these are all things that if you take the rhetoric that surrounds these issues and say, well, if you really mean, if one person gets away with it, then it's too much, then you will turn into a totalitarian. And again, Calvin Coolidge said it best in that Business and the Free Press. All authoritarianism rests upon how do you say it? A perverted and distorted, view of human relationships, something along those lines. In other words, authoritarianism is based on a lie, and we believe that our system is based on the truth. And so we should never fear the truth because, as again, kind of sort of taking what Coolidge said, the next step, every act of truth telling in context, because lies will look like truth, and effective lying takes a small truth and blows it out of proportion. But that's why context is so important all the time. But we should never fear the truth in context, because every act of truth telling in context is an act of patriotism. If you believe that our government is in fact based on the true fact that human beings can live at peace with one another. And I think our experience has shown that human beings can live at peace with one another. That's not
In
a
the
lot.
last couple hundred years in America,
Yeah. I've done a
Civil
pretty good
War.
job of living at peace with with people. Most people are capable of it.
So I'm not sure where I want to take this conversation next, because we now only have 15 or so minutes. I do want to talk a little bit about national relationships and authoritarians around the world. Um, I, it's clear that Trump has authoritarian tendencies. I mean, when he says there's time, we just need to abolish the Constitution or parts of the Constitution occasionally. Well, I'm sorry, you're just ineligible to serve in the position of president. You can't say that and serve, in my opinion. Um, you can't get people around January 6th, everything he did and fake electors and stuff. You just can't choose that you can decide this, not our federalist system and 50 state election. He just said, whatever, I'm doing my own thing. So, anyway, that's one. But there's a whole swath of my liberal friends who only believe it's Trump and radical right or Christian nationalists, and they're the bad. And I have some tendency to concur with them in many instances. But they totally ignore that there's another movement. And I gave you that statistic earlier about the percentage of liberals that are lean towards authoritarianism. Can you kind of walk us through that to just have people, maybe not an aha moment, but at least a little slow down to say, maybe I need to look at my own mirror?
Yeah, and I think actually there's a new podcast series from the Atlantic, and Ann Applebaum is one of the hosts, and it's on the origins of authoritarianism. So I thought, is John asking me about this because of this new podcast series from the
I
Atlantic?
hadn't heard of it.
Oh, so but one of the things that it's by and large a good, so far. There's only 2 episodes in, but it's pretty good. But you're right, it sort of leaves out half of the story. So here's what, if I were a consulting producer on this, I would have said, you're kind of missing out on something my friend Tom Brasino once said. Oh, you must love Trump because this is how you get more Trump. And that is when institutions are powerful institutions in life are forgiving the lies of one side because they contain partial truths and because they can be blown out of proportion. And I'll give some examples that might seem small, but they were really significant. The people who defended Bill Clinton, you know, who said, you know, oh, it's a technicality, whatever the arguments were. You
You
just
mean the lie
knew,
in court?
yeah, but just every part of how he approached the scandal surrounding the intern, um, that you just knew, well, you're bending over backwards to say smart sounding lies. Or when President Obama um, sent out his minions to, tell a story about Benghazi, and then later say, well, he said act of terror. And I just want to go back in time to every single person who defended that particular lie and say, that's it exactly. It's when you do this. This is when you convince people that the system is rotten, that there's no point in trying, and that the only solution to this is our own authoritarian. Because just because you have an authoritarian who you are defending because he's technically right, you can find some sort of technical reason. Or when he or his administration, we don't know who did this exactly, but the misrepresented information regarding the wiretapping of Trump during the campaign, and probably because they thought Trump was going to lose, that it would never, come out, or that, yeah, of course, nobody wants to defend Trump, but the but they misused the FISA court system. It's and people will still bend over backwards to defend what Obama did in how he presented that information. They'll say, oh, well, he included it, right? Well, it's in a footnote, and, minimizing this other exculpatory evidence, presenting other, yeah, in other words, wow, they will bend over backwards in order and as long as it's a smart sounding lie, they'll defend it. And
Let,
that's the kind of thing that undermines our confidence in the system.
let's let our counselor-in-law jump in with a comment or question on this subject since he's ready.
Yeah, no, I'm ready, and I realize you did mention the Supreme Court very early on, only once. I'm not going to really ask about that though. What I want to do is ask Stephen. This is a comment and I guess a question. I really do appreciate your statements about how government in this country is designed not necessarily to solve problems, but to let us discuss problems. How do you explain to me where the fact that state legislatures pass laws, a lot of laws, and Congress actually passes a lot of laws, even when it's as dysfunctional as it is now. And passing those laws is designed to kind of work on problems that we do have. How is that okay within the paradigm of what you're talking about?
Well, we tend to talk about national politics a lot, and we emphasize a lot of what we call our negative liberties. But the other side of the coin is your positive liberties, which is that you do get to have an influence on your town, your county, your state, your and how you get to have an influence on those things is through the democratic process. So it's funny because we tend to see, or at least I do, sort of democracy run amok as the sort of big problem, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a proper role for democracy. And this is something that often in conservative circles or libertarian circles in particular, I would find myself often defending the liberal position, because I would say, listen, like, if Santa Cruz wants to pass some sort of local ordinance, and it passes, like, you got to decide if you want to live in Santa Cruz. That is the appropriate place for that type of local problem solving. I would have a problem if Santa Cruz was telling, as they often do, I'm trying to think of, like, Gilroy, what to do, which is a more let's say middle of the road kind of a town in the interior. The problem comes when you start drawing your circle of a little too big. And John mentioned federalism, something I haven't discussed. So this is really the role of federalism, that the best place to experience your positive liberties is and this is the old Whiggish formulation that got incorporated into the Republican Party via Lincoln. The Lincolns used to say the proper role of government is to do for a community of citizens what they cannot do or do so well for themselves in their separate but individual capacities. And in all other things, government ought not to interfere. But there are many things that we can do together that we can't do individually. I love having a sewer system. I love having my trash picked up. I love having the roads maintained. These are all things that, absolutely are done, and they involve compulsion of your fellow citizens, because there are some people who are like, I don't care about the roads on the other side of town. No, we're going to fix all the roads in this town. And we're going to put all of them on a maintenance schedule. So
let me interrupt.
Yeah.
Well,
we're supposed to feel these things.
I love that statement on the role of things that we really do want government, almost across the spectrum. Almost everybody, conservative, liberal, left, right, Republican, Democrat, would agree with that. I would also say the most important function of government. So you went from micro, let me go to macro. Then one of the most important functions of government is safety, is to protect us so we can engage in peace or transfer of goods for money. And there are bullies, or that's a kind word for people who will just kill you. But there are bullies around the world. So I like having a very strong national defense, because I think history has taught us there are groups of people that will just take our stuff, kill you and take your stuff if you have stuff to take.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just kind of a human nature thing that we can't get rid of. So does America have a role, American exceptionalism, have a role in protecting not only ourselves, but also others that wish to live in peace? Or
Yes.
no, we can just let them do whatever they want to do. The road analogy at a map.
And it is in keeping with both our ideals and our interests. It's not just our ideals, it's also our interests. And I sometimes will say to my students, we don't go to bed at night, fearing New Zealand, right? Nobody wakes up in the morning, oh my God, what's New Zealand going to do to us next, right? How about Australia? England, Canada? Are we worried about any of these places? Norway? What are the Norwegians going to do to us next? No. And the point is that for every country on earth that is safe and prosperous and free, it makes us safer and more prosperous and more free. But we live in a world full of places that aren't like Sweden, that aren't like Norway, they're not like Switzerland, they're not like New Zealand. They're not like Japan now. They what they want is to use violence to impose their will on others. And so we have to greet the world as it is and say we're going to um, make sure that we serve as an example for the rest of the world that human beings can govern themselves. And we will always encourage other nations to do this, and it will continue to serve as an even more powerful example that human beings can govern themselves.
So let me take, love that statement. Let me take three issues and conflate them into one, which is in the brevity of time. It would be better if we had another hour or two. I would do this in a different way, but we have a few minutes left. So let me just say a couple controversial things. First, name name at least four of the world's worst dictator, authoritarian, evil regime. You can take whatever you want, but name the top three or four or five that we should be worried about
Oh boy. It,
by
um,
name. And this means you won't be able to travel there. So be careful what you say.
yeah. Boy, because the worst ones are often not necessarily a threat to the United States.
Oh,
So,
throw in a couple of them too. Name the top eight.
well, I just know that now
Surprise you're hedging.
I'm going to combine worst with that we have to worry about. So,
Good.
Iran,
Yep.
Russia,
Yep.
China,
Yep.
North Korea.
Yep. Okay.
Um,
Those are the top four.
yeah.
It's President Bush's axis of evil plus one. Um, cool. What are a couple though that you were going to throw in that be careful, you might want to travel there someday? What are the other ones we should be at least aware of as something to be
Venezuela,
Yep.
um, gosh, almost every place in Central America
Right.
has, but also a lot of the dictators in Africa. You can almost go down the list and say, like, uh,
There's a ton of them. Yeah.
almost all of them, are more oppressive to their own people than we could even conceive of.
Okay, so here's the conflation. You mentioned a couple of Central American countries, but you didn't mention Mexico. And Professor, we are being invaded. I don't mean this. I hope you can hear the fascistas, the satire. We are being invaded by all sorts of people. I won't even use the words that our former president said, but there's a ton of people that are coming in illegally and some legally, but there's a ton of people, and that is the greatest threat to America. Now, about 45% to 55% of Americans agree with that statement. We are being invaded by illegal immigration. Talk to us about what role does an authoritarian play in this? How do we solve this problem? Don't we need an authoritarian to solve this problem?
No, I mean, so I guess I would disagree with every part of the statement.
Right, which is
Because
why you're on the show. So
that,
help us think
that
through.
number one, it's not an invasion. Number two, it's not from Mexico. Number three, even if it were, we could solve this problem without resorting to any sort of authoritarianism. And I would then say, like, number four, or I don't know if I'm on four or five, but that we would have almost nothing to fear if we had more faith in our institutions, because if we weren't cynical about our institutions, if we had a strong and powerful and self-aware ideological nation state that was perpetuating the beliefs of the founders, one of the things that's pretty amazing is that we were able to incorporate far more foreign-born citizens with foreign beliefs at a time when you would say our institutions were much less capable of doing this, but our culture was so much stronger. Our cultural institutions were so much stronger. It's so. I guess I disagree with every part of
Are you
that.
sure you're still a conservative? Are you sure you're still a Republican? Are you sure you're what? This sounds the opposite of everything that's come out in the last 5 to 10 years.
I have no idea why, because as I've tried to explain, as an American conservative, what I'm trying to preserve is the ideals of the founding. So I don't know what definition other people have of what an American conservative is trying to conserve, but if they're trying to conserve something other than the founding, then I would say they're not American conservatives. And if you're doing it out of love, then you're a patriot. So anybody who, doesn't want to preserve the ideals of the founders and doesn't love the founding ideals, they're not patriotic and they're not conservatives, at least by any definition that makes sense to me.
So everything's topsy turvy right now in American campaigns and American language, American labeling. We're just a mess. Institutions. We're
Yeah.
just kind of a big mess right now.
Yeah. I mean, I got an email this morning from about something that's happening at work that if I don't, as I said to Alex last week, I don't think people have any idea how bad things are in educational institutions. I mean, I could just forward you a single email that I got this morning.
It's not violating your contract.
Just I don't even. It's such a complicated issue. I don't think I could summarize it. It would take 40 minutes to even get you up to speed on what the issue is, but it has to do
A
with.
conversation on education, but make that analogy. So you agree with Alex about that in education. Do you agree with Alex about that in America's role in imposing he specifically brought up LGBTQIA stuff and overseas stuff. Do you agree that we have no idea what a mess it is overseas and how we're trying to impose our values on authoritarians
I don't
across
know.
the world?
I don't know. I will plead ignorance. It's so far outside my field of knowledge or expertise. I have no basis to
Fair enough.
say anything about that. Yeah.
Okay, you agree on education, but we're not sure about U.S. foreign policy.
Well, I can speak confidently on many aspects of foreign policy, but that specific area that he was bringing up is something that I I don't even know
Where
of
to begin?
anyone who studies that or how we would. I mean, it would take a long time just to even decide what the framework of how you would approach that. That would be, it would take some brain cells and a lot of hours to even figure out how to approach how we would begin to study that problem, let alone speak confidently about whether it exists. And
Let me find an area of disagreement then. I was hesitant to ask this, but let me just ask it. We should not be emulating Orban as a way of acting in the United States. Hey, some problems are just so frustrating. We got to solve it. We need to move towards authoritarianism to solve problems. That's not a good role model. President Trump brought it up as his major endorsement.
but this is, I mean, again, it's part of the appeal of authoritarianism and is plain speaking. And again, I want to get back to something that my friend Tom Brasino used to say. This is how you get more Trump, which is that when you're engaged in smart sounding lies and gobbledygook that really boil down to, I want more power for me and I want to shove my I want to force you to live and control your life in every possible way. What is and will be appealing to you is someone who tells them to go F themselves and does it in a powerful and clear and plain way. So, of course they're going to, it's going to be appealing when somebody is just standing up and saying no. Like, again, it doesn't have to be more articulate than Trump after the assassination attempt. Fight, fight, fight.
Say that last point again.
Oh, it doesn't have to be any more complicated. I mean, all you want when somebody is trying to overwhelm you with bureaucracy and law and all of the institutions of government that are conspiring against you to control your life. What you're looking for in those moments is you just want somebody who's saying, I'm on your side and fight and no and wrong and bad, and sometimes that is needed and it does take courage. That's why I've often said, like, you know, if there was somebody like a Trump, who wasn't Trump, I probably would have supported many of the things, because our society does need and would benefit from someone who was plain speaking, uh, and
Let's go in a direction.
yeah, blunt,
Yeah.
clear, patriotic, and um, people would respond to an Eisenhower. People would respond to a Reagan. Um, they would respond to a Coolidge, you know. But Trump is none of those people.
Right.
But he is blunt sometimes.
Right.
And he is capable of sometimes uttering the correct 1 to 3 word sentence.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Kathy, you're going to get a chance to ask a question here in about 3 minutes if you have one. So be pondering that. Same with you, Jake, before you have to go back to class. I want to emphasize one or two more things before we go those questions. Professor, left
Yep.
and right. When somebody says, hey, the left has got to fight or the right is nuts or whatever they say, you'd urge them to back off those labels because they don't mean anything now, or that means the wrong thing that they think. Will you just have us think about that more, left and right in America?
Yeah, I mean, the left-right political spectrum is something that implies that somehow the beliefs of the left are the opposite of the beliefs of the right, and it also implies that somehow someone who is an American conservative or an American liberal exists on a spectrum that if you're a little bit more liberal, you're a leftist, and if you're a little bit more conservative, you're a fascist or a monarchist. And those things are not true. So it's an inapt metaphor. It's an inapt tool for understanding American politics. It conceals more than it reveals. So therefore, we should drop it as a framework. We should drop the label entirely. And the analogy is, Jake, get your fingers ready. The tangled tree. How the metaphor of a tree made us misunderstand evolution. Bad metaphors and graphics will often lead, in the case of evolution, led to a lot of bad science and bad social science being based on bad science, because evolution doesn't work like a tree, but it's a visual image that people can understand because they've seen trees. And saying that the people in America are on the left and the right, yeah, I get it. It's a line. People can understand a line. They understand sides, but that's not how human beings are, and that's not how American politics has ever been. The other thing, the Lewis brothers book, The Myth of Left and Right, did a pretty good job of outlining this. And if you want to read the shorter version, read my review of The Myth of Left and Right that was in Vital Center, where I try to
In
summarize.
sum, is it possible to say that if you're a leftist or a rightist, you're the opposite of what an American should be?
Yeah, yeah. You are outside of what an American is. If you are someone who denies that individuals have rights, you are outside of the American political tradition. If you deny individual liberty, you are outside of the American political tradition. And you have more in common with other people who deny that individuals have rights. So the people we put on the left and the right, a monarchist has more in common with a socialist and a fascist is a national socialist. Mussolini was the first fascist, and he was the head of the Socialist Party in Italy, right? And his argument was between, should we have national socialism or international socialism? But both of them are predicated on the denial that individuals have rights.
Okay, very helpful. I'll give one more definition on peace, or sorry to ruin it for you. what is the definition of capitalism, or how should we envision that?
I
Uh,
just capitalism is another one of these terms that comes around later that sort of obscures the most important element about how our founders understood property. They didn't understand property as um, uh, you know, in the abstract, a positive good, because absent the human experience, property has no value. So they thought a lot about how does property attach to the individual? And the answer is that, according to Madison, that property is the external manifestation of all of your individual rights. You can't practice any of your individual rights except in a world where other human beings exist and in a world where you are in the physical world. It's like saying I have freedom of speech, but physics doesn't exist. No, it doesn't. In order to engage in freedom of speech, you have to be standing somewhere. You have to, in order to have freedom of the press, you have to be able to have paper. This is property. This is an external manifestation of my many rights that I have. And that's how we conceive of property. And so the idea that that we can negotiate between our rights peacefully means that, of course, your many property rights must be protected as part of protecting all of the rights that every individual has. And there's no possible way of ever divorcing your property rights from the rights that you have as an individual. I mean, it's like saying humans could only do this if we were spirits. According to, I mean, the founders never said that, but it's following their logic, and I wrote, my essay on Madison and property. Thank you, Jake, for that.
I don't know if I've read that. I'll have to read that.
Yeah, and Madison, they tried to explain all this stuff. I always say they cleverly hid their ideas in newspapers and in public documents. Like it wasn't like they were trying to hide this stuff from the American people. In fact, they're often writing about it in public because, people were already not understanding this while they were still alive. And so they'd write, oh, by the way, this is what we did and why. And
In
it's
layman's terms, is it semi-accurate to say that capitalism, or the peaceful exchange of money and goods, and the
I
ability
just
to
don't even like the term capitalism, right? It was invented by a bunch of Marxists. Like, it's
keep
not a
going?
term that even, it's like, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like it's like talking about space shuttles in the 1800s. Like they weren't talking about space shuttle. Or there was a book, actually, this historian did this thing, and it is I won't name him, but he was a great historian from Colorado.
Why are you not naming him then?
Oh, Fred Anderson. He was like one of the great old-fashioned, wonderful narrative historians. Fred Anderson. Love his books, and he wrote a book like sometime in the 1990s, and he referred to I wish I could remember what book it was, but he referred to the pamphlets that people were reading during the revolutionary period. He referred to them as blogs and bloggers. And I remember thinking, oh, what are you trying to do? Don't try and hip it up. Like
Right.
these weren't bloggers, these weren't blogs. I understand you're trying to make a modern audience understand this, but even in the year 2024, I bet if somebody went back and read that book, I wish I could remember what it was. It was one of his shorter books. Like nobody today would be like bloggers. the founding fathers were bloggers, like yeah. So I feel the same way about capitalism. Like, why are you using this term from 50 years later when the people at the time would have had no idea what you were talking about?
That's fine as a history professor, so I get your point on that, but still it is now in the vernacular, right?
Right, but it's in the vernacular in a way that makes people misunderstand the legal and political history of the United States.
So,
So stop it.
so say
So
it again then. What
it's
is, if we're not using capitalism, what word do we use?
freedom, peace, um, whatever word the founder, whatever words Madison used, property, rights, unalienable, inalienable, use their words and explain what they mean.
If I have something, or if I need to feed my family, or if
Just take what the word capitalism implies. It was first it was an insult, because it was based on the idea that these people, like the American founders, are under the mistaken idea that property exists. And because they believe this lie, believing that lie is the most important thing, and the only thing need to know about them is that they are under the mistaken impression that property exists. They are propertyists. They believe in propertyism. It's a false religion. So why take that term it's kind of like racism. I feel the same way about racism, like, yeah, old people, I shouldn't say old people, people in the past lied. We don't need to, what's that Harris quote everybody makes fun of her for saying, so unburdened by the past or something, like,
we are unburdened by what has been.
Yes, right. There you go. We should be unburdened by what has been. We don't need to carry the lies of the past into the future. We need to understand them. We need to explain them, but we don't need to adopt them as a framework. If somebody says like, I'm trying to think of it.
Tie your concluding thoughts here together, because we are out of time.
I was just trying to think of a metaphor when it came to like home building. I don't know. If somebody said we don't need to meet modern earthquake standards. We need to instead build a thing to sacrifice virgins to appease the sun gods. You'd say, I'll stick with the earthquake standards because, I live in California, the earthquakes here, I don't need the construction of my house to be burdened by this false belief from the past that we need to murder people in order for the sun to come up.
Right. So without using the word capitalism, though, you have an idea, you have a product, you want to eat, and you see somebody else who also wants to eat. They have something you need, though, to survive. You exchange your goods. You exchange a lot. You decide to make more. You have an economy based off this. People have free exchange of ideas and goods for products, services, whatever we call that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the opposite of authoritarianism? That's my point.
A phrase that we kind of like sometimes is ordered liberty.
Okay.
Understanding that what it is that makes us free is that you can only really be free in a system that protects freedoms, plural, and that anarchy is not freedom. So we throw the word ordered on there to remind us that anarchy and letting the violent do whatever they want, that's not freedom. That's right. And anarchy is the opposite of freedom, not freedom to its logical extent.
Excellent. My last thrust question, we're out of time, but my last one is, it is in some ways difficult to compete in all the non-problem solving government we have, and all the chaos of anybody being able to do what they want to do when they want to do it. Say, I'm sorry, I quit. There's exceptions in the military. You just can't quit without some processes. But in the most part, in America, we're pretty freedom loving, and we can do what we want when we want to do it. Competing against China, that's kind of tough, right? Well, what happens if we lose? What happens if China, you can do whatever you want in economy, but boy, you say something about the leader and you're going to be executed. Well, boy, that's kind of an easier system to compete in, as long as you're on the winning side, right? As long as you're in the ruling tribe or party. Isn't that how do we compete? Can democracy win? A
Yes.
constitutional republic?
Right. Yes. The answer is yes.
Why?
Because if our beliefs are based on the truth, if they are correct, and if it is in fact true that what's best for society is organizing people so that they can live lives of peace and achieve their own dreams. That embracing that thing that entwines itself about the human heart that will lead to enterprise and industry to all, that will result in a nation that is so powerful that no country could ever challenge it or destroy it. There is nothing better than that. There can't be. I have absolute faith in that.
Lovely. What would you like to finish with if it's not that?
I'm wondering if Bart has any thoughts.
Sure, Bart.
Just had to unmute. I have really appreciated this discussion. This has been great. And I guess I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole, but it's kind of ironic. It seems ironic to me that we're involved in a presidential election to go up to the 50,000 foot level, where the left-wing liberal candidate is being considered a better option to conserve the founding of the country. It's rather ironic, because I think some of the things Alex was trying to say last week, but I think he has his hardest problem of being a messenger, and I know he's not here, so he can't defend himself, is that he has a personal candidate problem. I actually agree with a lot of his arguments. I just don't believe that his candidate would actually do what Alex is arguing for, because I cannot trust his candidate. And, and I realize he's right that Kamala Harris, might be more of a danger to property rights. I kind of find that hard to believe for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that she's a lawyer like John and I.
Yeah.
And lawyers aren't going to take property rights away in this country. I mean, that's one of the things they still will actually teach you in law school. Number one, you respect all property rights. Right. So it's just rather ironic. I don't know.
Well, if we're describing, as we have, the difference between a cancer and a heart attack, the people who are saying, "Hey, this is a cancer," they have a point. But when one of these people is a cancer that you might be able to treat, then that's what you pick rather than the heart attack that strikes you dead.
That was like the least popular endorsement for Kamala Harris I've ever heard. So it would fit on a bumper sticker, by the way.
Yeah.
It is just not we're not going to put you in the campaign mode on the Harris campaign.
Yeah. Well, that's just the thing is I'm also unburdened by what has been. So, I can speak very freely about these issues,
Fair enough. Bart, is that good enough for today on that subject? Or
absolutely. Okay. That is just fine. After we get off the recording, I want to ask Stephen a question that's not for this.
Professor, Professor, any last word?
No, just, I've heard from a couple students who have found the podcast, and they're very curious about you. And I got to tell them kind of our origin story, and it was just nice to remember it. And it's nice that we're still doing it after all these years.
It is nice. But what do you mean curious? Like who's the weirdo?
Yeah. like they're both from Colorado, and what, and I got to tell the whole story. It was great.
Nice.
Anyway, I just
nice.
I think it's pretty cool that like some students would seek this out and listen to it for fun. I don't know if they're looking for answers.
Try to give some extra credit
or something, but I think it's great. I mean, for everything that's wrong, and let me also just say, like on a more positive note, for everything that's wrong with society, I can easily complain about the fact that like 1/3 of my online students use AI to cheat. But what you might not know is that I also see 4 classes of 65 students who are just in my class doing the work, doing everything you would want to see Americans do. And I get to see it 4 days a week, and they're just, it just you should feel affirmed in everything that you guys are doing, because there are people out there that want to do the right thing and want to live good lives and want to be good Americans. And yes, by the way, if I need to point this out, I live in an incredibly diverse environment, so if you were to look at my classroom, it would look very different than the rest of America. But it only looks different if you're just looking on the outside. Their hearts, their brains, they're just outstanding. And so how many people get to say after 26 years of doing something, I'm having more fun doing it than I've ever had in my life?
Lovely.
And it's totally cool.
Because of the students, though. It's so for everything that's going wrong in society, just know that, man, there are a lot of good kids out there.
That is awesome. Let's conclude with that. Let me see if I can stop us or not. And Bart, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to stop us. We may have to just talk in a different way.
Can't you? And just hit end recording.